Hello and welcome back. Today I have a fun video because I get to show Elonie's finished quilt, and then we are going to be talking all about homespuns. I'm going to be answering some of the questions that you've left and showing you this fun quilt. I tried to get Elonie to come down here and film this video with me so that she could show off her quilt herself, but she declined. So I will have the fun of showing you her quilt. And here it is. She chose this fun palette of dark blues and blacks and dark greens, and it turned out so warm and cozy. She had decided on a Sunday that she wanted to make a quilt. By Wednesday, she was eager to go pick out fabrics. She got most of her fabrics that first Wednesday, and then on the Friday after, so just 2 days after that, she got the rest of the fabrics she needed. She was picking out fat quarters from some of our local quilt shops. And so Friday, she got everything pre-washed. I think she had everything ironed. I cut everything out for her. She could have cut this out herself, but we saved some time and I cut everything out for her, and then she did all of the sewing and had it complete by Sunday. So in a week's time, she decided she wanted a quilt, picked out the fabrics, made the quilt. She was very speedy and determined, and this was her first quilt that she made. So I think it turned out so pretty. It was really fun to see her fabric choices, see what she was picking. Definitely different choices than I would pick right now, but I don't know if it's too far off from what I would have picked at her age, which is neat to see. And her comments while she was choosing fabrics were hilarious. She was really funny. We're going to be sending this out for long arm quilting, and so she has been looking at different quilting designs. I think she's definitely going to lean towards something geometric. If you see any flowers, hearts, swirls, feathers on this quilt top, I would be very surprised because I think we are going to land somewhere in the squares, rectangles, lines sort of category. She's chosen a 108-inch wide flannel for the backing of this quilt, and I think we're going to use a bamboo batting. So that should keep it nice and drapey and soft and lightweight, and I think that is going to be just perfect. When we started chatting about the fabrics that Elonie was choosing for this quilt, a lot of homespun questions started popping up, and I wanted to take some time in today's video and answer some of those questions. So I jotted down the ones that I found. If I missed your question, you can feel free to leave it again, and I will do my best to answer that in an upcoming video. Also, if I mispronounce your name when I read your question, please let me know. Some of you that I am reading questions from, I chat with fairly often in my comments or on other social media, and I always say your name a certain way in my head, so if I'm not saying it right, just let me know. I'm going to start with a question from Aviva Hadas. Are all homespuns equal? A few years ago, I think all of the Moda designers put out a woven line. I used several of them to make a masculine quilt. My true investment in wovens are the Japanese taupes, which in my mind are more tightly woven and feel more substantial when I am working with them, which I admit is super subjective. I officially have not done any testing. I would hope that someone has, maybe a business that is selling them as part of quality control so that their customers remain satisfied. So I do think that homespuns are not created equal. I know that the Moda Silky Wovens are the same thread count as their quilting cottons, and that is a higher thread count than some of the homespuns are. And I would have to imagine that it's going to vary a little bit from company to company, but I can't say that with any great authority. It does seem that some of them are a little bit more tend to fray, have less body. You know, you can just sort of feel the difference when you're working with them. So I do think that they are not all created equal. And for that reason, that's why I approach working with them a little bit different than I do if I'm working with quilting cottons from a well-known fabric company, because my expectations of what they will and won't do are a little bit different. Let's just move on to the next question. This one comes from Mary Ann Bosward 1081. She says, I love it when you go into detail with questions. My question is, how do you wash fat quarters without having them come out a mess? Even when I put them into a smaller laundry sleeve, they all end up in a ball with tangled threads on every side. Yes, if you're a pre-washer, you've noticed that fabrics do tend to ravel pretty much if you just chuck them in the wash, chuck them in the dryer, and don't handle them any differently. Now, I have some of these so I could show you. Let me sort these a little bit. So these are the fabrics from Elonie's quilt, and I didn't treat them any certain way. I don't mind the raveling on Homespuns, and I just trim it off, and then when I am cutting the pieces, everything gets trimmed off anyways. But I wanted to show you, if you've not worked with Homespuns, what to expect. Let me see if I can get one that's extra thready here. So these, we'll grab this one here. When all of these fat quarters came out of the dryer and I washed them hot, dried them hot, that's probably how I'm going to end up washing her quilt. I wanted to make sure that I was setting dyes and pre-shrinking fabrics because homespuns do shrink more than quilting cottons. So I didn't want to have any fuss with strange pre-shrinking when the final quilt was done. So that is why I pre-wash and dry all of the fabrics in a homespun quilt. And I do not pre-wash quilting cottons in general unless I'm super concerned about a bleeding issue. So for these, they all got pre-washed. And you can see this guy right here. He's got a fair amount of raveling here at the end. A lot of loose threads, probably 1/4 inch or so of fraying on this edge. These sides I would have cut when I was cutting the fat quarter into squares. So you can see kind of what we're working with here. Now, not all of them raveled as much. This one didn't have as much here. Mostly just a really cute little fray along that edge. Again, about 1/4 inch or so. They're all going to ravel a little bit differently. Let's find another one that was a little spicy. Maybe this guy down here. So this one here had a fair amount. And, you know, when they come out of the dryer, it was just a mess, all knotted together, threads wrapped around, all just sort of in one big mess. And so she just trimmed threads, trimmed away long threads, ironed everything, made it nice and tidy, and then this is what the squares looked like then after they were completely cut. These were squares that she didn't use, so she would have handled these a fair amount. They are not starched, so just, you know, from her working through these pieces, they do ravel and fray more than quilting cottons do. So you can kind of see what you're looking at. Now, if raveling is something that just makes you a little crazy and you don't want to fuss with that, you do have ways that you can work around the raveling. You can pink all of your edges, like on a fat quarter, just pink all of your edges either with a pinking shears, or you can get pinking blades for your rotary cutter. Pink all of your edges. If you have a serger, you can serge all of your edges. You could do a stay stitch just a little bit in from the perimeter, from the edge of your fabric all the way around. And you can also clip all 4 corners of your piece at about a 45-degree angle, maybe a 1/2 inch or so in on all of those 4 corners. And that can help with the fraying as well. And you might just experiment with which method you prefer, or you might go my route and just skip that altogether and trim everything up. Whether you are clipping corners, serging, stay stitching, pinking, you're still going to lose a little bit of that fabric around the exterior edge. So in my mind, you know, the fraying and then trimming does not make me lose more fabric than using one of the other methods. But you have to choose what works best for you. Different quilters are going to have different opinions on that, and you're going to land on whichever method works best. All right. I think that was all I wanted to say about that. And Marianne had mentioned putting fabrics in a laundry sleeve. That's a great suggestion. That can help eliminate fraying as well. But as she said, even sometimes with that, taking that extra step, you can still have fraying. But that's another thing to keep in mind too. Melody walls. 4693 asked a similar question. In another video, you said you typically don't pre-wash. Is homespun an exception? Does it wash up differently? So I think I kind of covered that it does shrink more than quilting cottons do. It can dye, it can bleed. We're working with, you know, pretty saturated colors here. There's lots of good reds in homespuns too. So when you're working with those more saturated colors, those are times when you might opt to pre-wash in addition to the pre-shrinking. Moving on to my back page. Okay, so this question came from Carol Spady, 7635. When working with plaid, check, or gingham, do you worry about keeping the lines matched up? A seasoned quilter told me never to use those as the lines start veering off and make your blocks look wonky. This is a great question because this applies not only to homespun fabric, but also to quilting cottons. Any of those geometric type prints, the ones she mentioned, I would add in polka dots, or even, you know, maybe you have a print that has like very evenly spaced little flowers, or something that is, you know, it can be a floral print, but it can have more of a geometric placement. If we don't pay attention to how we're cutting, our blocks can look wonky quickly. So I do like to straighten up my fabrics for quilting cottons more than I actually would do for a whole quilt of homespuns where everything is plaids and checks. I'm gonna pull out, I had shared my yellow brick road quilt. I'm gonna pull that one out and kind of show that to you so you can see how the prints in there work without being straightened up. But you can take that extra step to straighten. I do it in quilting cottons. If I'm working with a stripe, a plaid, a check that is a larger scale check, like those 1-inch checks that I have in some of my fabric lines, I always straighten those up before using them. I'm careful with how the stripes run in blocks if I am piecing with stripes in a block, because if you have your stripe running parallel to your seam, you're going to notice much more if that stripe is running a kilter than if you have your stripe running perpendicular to your seam. So I pay attention to things like that when I'm piecing blocks. And I also tend not to piece a lot of fussy blocks with those more geometric prints, because if you're piecing maybe a star, for example, you might not mind if your pieces don't run, your prints don't run exactly straight vertically and horizontally, but it's something that you might notice. So you just have to be thoughtful about, do I want to straighten this up, or do I want to use a different print within this block? It's just something to keep in mind. I don't think that we should completely steer away from using those prints in quilt making. I think that they can make very dynamic choices, but sometimes we do need to think a little bit about, do we straighten them up? Do we maybe use a different print in this specific block and save my geometric print for a differently pieced block? Just kind of think about those things as you're making those choices. But I want to pull this quilt here. So this one would have been a quilt that I made, you know, in my earlier years of quilt making, and I wouldn't have paid any attention to straightening up prints. And I certainly didn't pay attention to straightening up prints in Elonie's quilt because I didn't think it was going to matter. And I'll pull that one out. That one's a little bit harder to see with the darker fabrics, but this one, you can see that without paying much attention to how prints are running, you don't really think about it being askew. So, you know, this plaid isn't running exactly straight. You can see it down here. The stripe isn't exactly parallel to the seam on either end, but you don't really think about it. The same with like this stripe right here. You can see a little of the stripe at the bottom, but it just fades right into the seam as you work your way through. And it's not something that you really notice. I have seen some beautiful quilts, like sawtooth star quilts, made using all large scale plaids and geometrics. And when the whole quilt is done that way, I think you think about it less than if it's just one star within a quilt of everything else looking straight and tidy. So, you know, how you approach it in different projects might even be a little bit different. All right, so that's this one. And then I'll pull Elonie's too. And you can see we didn't straighten, and so you can see that once it's in a quilt, you don't really think about it when the pattern is like this. all squares, all geometrics. You know, like this one right here. I mean, that's looking pretty crooked on camera. Once it's all quilted up, you're not even going to really think about that at all. And it's up to you. If you wanted to take the time to straighten those up, you certainly could. And like I said, if I am doing a quilt with quilting cottons where I'm mixing in with like flowers and other designs that aren't geometric, I do often straighten up my prints so that they are running nice and straight. But you can see what this quilt looks like here. All right, next question comes from Carol Sews. She says, when I was an inexperienced quilter, I took a class for making a rag quilt. We were instructed to use unwashed homespuns. One of my fabrics was red and another beige. When I washed the finished quilt, the beige turned pink. I tried washing it with Synthropol, and much of the color was removed from the red fabric, leaving a faded mauve. Some of the pinkness disappeared from the beige fabric. Is there anything besides not using a red homespun that could have been done to prevent this dye disaster? So Carol, I think I have the same quilt here. This was one of my very earliest quilts. This is a lot of flannel. There are some homespuns mixed in. And we have the pink beige right here. We've got a lot of these really saturated red fabrics, and it bled right into the beige. These rag quilts, the reason that they have you not pre-wash is because they want all of these edges to fray up. And that's why you don't pre-wash, but then, you know, beige and red, non-pre-washed fabrics can lead to a problem. So I might have the cousin or the sister to your beige and red quilt right here. Now, what I would do differently with this quilt would be during that initial washing time, and actually probably the first 3 washes. Usually if it's something so saturated in color with lights and then those reds. Reds are notorious for being problematic. You have to be real careful. And so let me grab what I would do now, what I would do differently would be to throw in Shout color catchers on those first 3 washes. And I would probably put in, I'm gonna say 2 or 3, probably 3 that first wash. I would wash on cold and dry on hot. And then the next time I washed it, I would do the same thing. Throw in a couple of these. And for the first couple washes, I would do that just to make sure that it doesn't bleed. I don't know when Shout color catchers came into play for quilters, but if you are not a Shout color catcher user, it might be worth considering, because for those of us that don't pre-wash, these are so handy. I don't pre-wash, as I mentioned, and I throw these in the first time I wash every quilt. And usually I'm not picking up much dyes. Usually most of the fabrics that I'm using are quilt shop quality fabrics, and they don't tend to lose a lot of dyes. But sometimes, you know, you've got a rogue fabric thrown in there, or you've got something super saturated, and you're going to have these just to save the day. So that's what I would have done differently. If I would go back and do this again, I would use Shout color catchers for my first few washes. And I will, even with Elonie's quilt that we pre-washed everything, the first time I'll probably throw one of those in just to make sure that there's no excess dyes that are going to cause any bleeding. It's just a really nice option to have. It picks up all of those loose dyes and you don't run into the bleeding problem. So that's what I would do for that. Next question comes from Amanda Askew 7606. I am very much looking forward to the Homespun video. I have been intrigued by them for so long. I finally broke down and purchased a Minnick & Simpson charm pack. It seems possibly softer. Is that correct, or just me? How do they hold up in the long run, and are they appropriate for backings, especially if they are softer? I feel like they would get softer with time/washing, but do they get thinner/wear quicker? Depending on who you talk to, you're going to get different answers probably to how long they wash and how well they wear. in my opinion, and this is just strictly my opinion, I think that they do wear a little bit quicker. They're thinner, and like especially I've used it for binding, and I just feel like after a while those binding edges are going to wear through a little bit faster than binding using a quilting cotton. Of course, I use straight grain binding, so my bindings are going to wear faster anyways. If you use bias binding, those don't wear as quickly as straight grain binding does. But I do think, and I have mixed like the Moda silky wovens, I've mixed that with quilting cottons. They both have the same thread count. The silky wovens do feel more lightweight than the quilting cottons do. And I don't have experience with it, but I just anticipate that maybe those wovens are going to wear a little faster than the quilting cottons. But I could be way off. They're super cozy, super nice to snuggle with, and quilts that we always grab are those that are like made with the wovens and then the minky backing. They're just so nice. Probably hopefully there's someone here in the comments who's maybe been making, my homespun / woven journey is not as long as some other quilters. I haven't made as many quilts with those textiles as some other quilters have. So maybe someone else who has made a homespun or / quilting cotton mixed with wovens fabrics could chime in. If they have a quilt that is 30 plus years old, that has been washed and used and loved well, we would love to hear your comments on how well those have held up. And my guess is that probably some of you will say, yes, it held up and washed well and we love it and still use it. And some of you will say the opposite, because it just seems to go that way. And there are just so many different qualities, I think, of different fabrics that we mix together and use, so our experiences do differ. But I would love to hear from someone who has a little bit more wash and wear on their homespun quilts than what I have, to chime in on that, because I can't say for certain, although my guess is that they would wear a little bit quicker than a quilting cotton, than a quality quilting cotton. So I don't know if that's helpful or not. They make super cozy quilts, and I don't think they're going to wear out super quick. We have ones that we've been using for quite a number of years that get heavy wash and use, and they are doing great. But, 30, 40 years from now, I don't know how those are going to be looking. I had a flannel quilt that someone made for me when I was there's 2 flannel quilts. And I realize this is off the topic of homespuns altogether, but 2 flannel quilts. One was purchased flannel from Walmart. I don't know where the other flannel one was purchased, but they were both used, washed, loved heavily for about 20 years. And both of them just wore right away. So I don't know if that was just where the flannels came from, if we just used the schmutz out of them or what exactly. But, that's an example of a quilt that was 2 quilts that were used, washed, loved very heavily, and they just wore out. So that does happen. All right, next question. This comes from Catherine of Kittis, 179. Do you stitch wovens with a shorter stitch length? Yeah, you probably could. We didn't for Elonie's quilt. I don't think I did for my Yellow Brick Road quilt, but it's something that some people will recommend doing. So, because they do fray a little bit more, it's something that you might choose to do, is use a shorter stitch length. The other thing that some people will say that you should do with homespuns would be to use a bigger seam allowance. Again, we did not do that on either of the Yellow Brick Road quilt or the quilt that Elonie just made. We did not use a bigger seam allowance. You'll get differing opinions on that as well. The other thing that I like to mention too is I prefer using a simpler pattern when I'm working with them. The fabrics are just lighter weight. I just think it's easier to work with them if it's a simpler pattern. I did want to grab this little stack of fabrics again here, because one other thing I wanted to mention too is after we had pre-washed and ironed these fabrics, if we had gone through and just given them a little bit of starch, that would have helped with the fraying that we get around our squares just from handling them a little bit. So these squares she would have just touched and, chose as she was working on her layout, and so they would have been handled, and you can see that they did start to fray even from just that little bit of use. So if you were doing some sort of piecing that required more handling, touching, working through the sewing machine, pressing, if these had been starched, it would have helped eliminate some of this. And pre-starching, you know, always helps eliminate fraying. Even if we're not using it for the pre-shrinking aspects that some of you use pre-starching for, it'll still help with the fraying. So that would have been something that we could have done to eliminate. And that is also something that helps gives them more body so that you can do trickier piecing. So I did want to mention that as well. I think that covers the questions that I got, a lot of the things that I wanted to chat about. If you have questions or if you can chime in about something I talked about, that would be very helpful. Feel free to leave those questions in the comments. If you are an avid homespun fabric user, your comments are very welcome with your experiences in using them. Like I said, I think that's going to vary from quilter to quilter, and the more tips and tricks we have, the better we can tailor that to our own desires. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you again next time.